Hi everybody, welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And today we are doing, sorry I almost knocked my light over. Today we're doing one of everybody's favorites. It's another gear episode, but
it's about lighting.
Yes, it's not gear specific necessarily, but we thought it'd be an interesting discussion to talk about whether or not it's useful to have dedicated strobes for macro and dedicated strobes for wide angle, or if you can kind of get by with just one set of strobes for everything. So we're gonna kind of take both sides on that today, and hopefully you guys can get something out of this. So Alex, why don't you start? And why would you want to have two separate strobes, one dedicated for macro, one for wide?
Well, I think you can definitely see both sides of the argument. If I was a strobe manufacturer or a camera shop, I'd be very keen to push the line that everyone needs to have different strobes for macro and different strobes for wide angle. And I think that was a big motivation behind Backscatter's two offerings at the moment, which are, some of the more popular strobes around amongst serious photographers, in that you've got their mini flash that no one would think really would be a serious tool for wide angle. You could use it in an emergency, no problem, but you're not going to get high quality wide angle shots with it. You'll get perfectly usable wide angle shots with it, but nowhere near as good as if you were using the HF1s for your wide angle. And whereas the HF1s can be a bit bulky for macro, and they actually don't turn down very much. And that for me is my main issue when using the macro, is actually they're too bright. Even if you put the ISO to like 50, if you're shooting with a reasonably open aperture, you can't turn them down enough. I think I think that certainly, like, within that stable, there's a very clear definition where they've gone, we've made this one for macro, and you're kind of pushing it if you use it for wide angle. We've made this one for wide angle, and you're kind of pushing it if you're going to macro. And I think that a number of companies have done that as well. I think in a lot of the strobes the backscatter strobes are manufactured in China. But the ones that are from some of the Chinese brands, you see quite a lot of them have made lithium strobes in the last few years, where they've made a big one and now they're making small ones. And I know you've tried the Kraken ones for that, and there's also like some of those other ones that seem to change their name. The GTX ones, I've seen a lot of their macro strobes on Facebook, but they were also making a big wide angle strobe at the same time. And I think that it's relatively easy for these companies to make these alternate products, and I think that as a result they do appeal, because one of the things that I think leads to excellence in underwater photography is optimization of gear, optimization of approach. And if you have strobes that are dedicated for a particular job, you're clearly going down that route of optimization. So that for me is, I can see that with some of the products that are on the market, they're almost forcing you into that choice. Also, there is an argument to say that if you can afford it, both from a travel space and from a purchasing point of view, then actually having both can give you the opportunity to really optimize your gear around what you're doing. In the same way that you're going to change lens and port when you go to wide angle, why not change strobe as well? And I think from a practical point of view, that's not that big a deal. So I can certainly see the arguments for.
I think so. I'm fortunate enough to have a whole host of strobes just laying around here, mostly for review, so I can kind of pick and choose what I want to use when. However, if I were buying a single set of strobes, I think I would probably try to find one that you can get by with both, in terms of shooting really high quality macro and shooting high quality wide angle. And one of the important things to with regards to that is, if you have a big, powerful strobe that's more geared towards wide angle, like the HF1s or Retros Pro Max or something like that, is having tools that allow you to make it a macro strobe. So snoots, reduction rings, being able to turn the power down enough. That's one of the things I've heard about the Retros as well, is that they're almost too strong even at the lowest power settings.
Well, Retro do have, although I think most people have forgotten it exists because they haven't been making fuss about it, they do have a low power mode that you can activate on the dial. So if you turn the dial into the low power mode, it then works on a lower power. Matt, you're freezing a little bit at the moment. You seem to be just making your way back in. Yeah, you just went you've got all pixelated and you froze for a moment, but I think you're returning to full resolution. But yeah, it's I think that's something that you're seeing more and more. I know that, for example, Retro with their forthcoming Maxi Strobe, it's got a ridiculous number of power settings. I think there's
Yeah,
16 clicks or something, and that's because they were very much aware that when you make a strobe that you can turn up so much, it's important to be able to turn it down as well. And so
yeah,
they've put more and more of those gradations on it because, I think the first question you should ask when someone says my strobe is really powerful, you go, well, how much can I turn it down as well? Because if a strobe is twice as powerful as the old one and it doesn't have a lot of strobe power, you will run out of power. Ultimately, though, I would say that for a lot of, I think you want to come in and say something actually before
Oh,
I
I was just going to make the point because I don't know if I actually did that. If you can afford it, both in terms of like your travel space and monetarily, I do think it can be useful to have a strobe that's geared more towards wide angle and then a strobe that's geared more towards macro shooting, especially because a lot of the macro centric strobes are significantly smaller, so they take up less space, they're easier to maneuver potentially, and a lot of them have straight flash tubes, which if you care about being able to shape lighter or have harsher light for more contrast and textures, it's easier to get that out of one of these narrower linear flash tubes than the big round flash tube that all of those or most of the big powerful strobes have these days.
or they have
So
multiple straight tubes. So
yes,
again, yeah, so
yeah,
you're having kind of the same issue.
yeah,
Um, I think one thing that for me is important is that, I think the line that I said in my book Underwater Photography Masterclass is for positioning strobes that are shaped like cake tins rather than beer cans are actually easier to maneuver because it's, if they're long like a beer can, you can't slide them in next to the port when you want to front light, particularly macro or super macro situations, and you end up having to side light those subjects. Now, there are times when you want to sidelight the subject, but not always. And so having that flexibility, and that's where smaller strobes or particularly shorter strobes really pay off. And that's something I like in the Retro design, is that with Retro's Pro Max series, is you have the ability to lengthen them with the extra battery capacity or have them at a relatively short size so they work perfectly well for macro. And as a traveling photographer, I would say that, having to take both big and small strobes isn't a great solution.
yeah.
That said, I think if both the big and the small strobes take the same batteries, that can actually reduce quite a bit your luggage capacity. So, say that like with the Marolux ones I was using on the trip, their big Apollo 3 takes 3 batteries, whereas their smaller Apollo S, which actually for me is actually still quite big. I've got a photo of it next to the HF1, and it's kind of almost HF1 size, a little bit smaller. That one takes 2 batteries, and I think they might now have an even smaller one. I'm not sure. So, but I think that's quite a good system. So if you do decide to go down the two macro strobe and wide angle strobe route, then if you get them from the same stable, there's a good chance there's a lot of redundancy in the parts, and you're able to swap things
Yeah.
between them as a way to go. Now, on the topic of this, I think you've been trying a strobe that no one else has tried yet
Yeah.
recently. So it would be really nice to hear about that. Oh, look at that! As if on cue.
Real
And
tiny.
that looks about the size of like one of those little cans of Coke they give you on aeroplanes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
really, really small. So this is Kraken's new KRS40. So the 40
S40.
stands, yeah, so the 40 stands for watt seconds. So
Mm.
in theory, 40 watt seconds at full power. It seems to me a little bit stronger than that.
Probably to the
Um,
narrow beam. When you
yes.
narrow the
So it
beam,
has
it
a
feels.
it has a very narrow beam. It has red and white focusing light. The red light's nice because then it shuts off during your exposure, which is always helpful. It's fiber optic only. And I think it has 5 power settings. I would like to see more, but keeping the cost down and the size down, I don't know how realistic that would be. But it has full power, half power, quarter power, and then a couple standby mode, which is useful. So if you really want to just turn it off for a second, you don't have to actually turn the whole strobe off. Has a single 21700 battery. And for anybody listening to me ramble here, there will be a written review for this in the next couple weeks. So if you want to see more pictures and you just want to read it instead of listening, that'll be available. But I really like it for macro shooting, and also a happy coincidence, it fits in the backscatter's optical snoot.
Without
Um,
any adapter.
Correct.
Just with their
So
standard adapter.
yeah, so it's a bit of a tight squeeze, but it does go on.
Better than
It
being
does go
loose.
on.
Yeah.
No, you're not getting it off.
No, but it's
um,
good. It's
yeah,
you don't want it to float away. So
yeah. So it does. Kraken's coming out with their own snoot for it, but if anybody already has the optical snoots, they work perfectly. I've been shooting them
does it
a
have a
lot.
central focus? Like, or how well does? Because I think one of the things I really like about the backscatter mini flash is how particularly the mini flash 2, you get such a bright spotlight from the torch when you're aiming it.
So the output from this is not as strong as the mini flash 2 in terms of the guide light. It's strong enough if you're shooting it at night. During the day, you might have a bit of trouble
Yeah.
seeing it. But I've really enjoyed them for macro shooting. Because like we talked about, the small size, you can kind of put them anywhere in the way, and then being able to use the snoot on there as well. They have a really cool cold color temperature, which for macro shooting doesn't matter too much. Unless you're a couple times I've been trying to shoot with some ambient light in the background for wider macro stuff, and then you can really see how cold the color temperature is.
You get very greeny water.
Yeah, and then or you get overly blue if you try to correct the Kelvin in camera. But I've really enjoyed them for macro. And they're small enough that I think if you had a big wide angle strobe like the retros or HF1 or something like that, these don't take up very much space at all, and they actually do the same battery as the HF1. So you could just kind of shove them in a corner of your bag and bring them on a macro trip if you want to do something like that, which I think would be useful.
Do you know what they're going to retail at?
360.
So that's very reasonable, in underwater photography gear terms.
Of
so I can see that being an attractive option for people.
Yeah, and if people like colors, they're also going to come in pink and seafoam. So if you want to accessorize your rig with big strobes, that'll be available as well. But yeah, it's a really cool little strobe. I do, like I said, I wish there was more power settings.
And do they have a simple on-off switch?
So it's just a push button on off. That's also a battery indicator, so it'll be blue or red or green. And then just one big fat dial in the back that's easy to grab. And there's hard stops at each power setting, so you're not gonna misalign it. I do wish there was I wish there was like somewhere in between the 40 and 20 setting. I wish there was 30. I think that'd be useful because sometimes 40 just seems a bit too powerful, and 20 sometimes a bit too low. But again, for a strobe that retails for 360, it does what you need it to do. So it's not going to be overly complicated.
Yeah, and you've got settings on your camera as well. It's
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think also, like I was saying earlier in the video, I think when you have a very powerful strobe, I think it's very important to have lots of power settings. Whereas if the strobe isn't actually all that powerful, then actually you have less of a need for more and more power settings, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And even without any accessories, it has a relatively narrow beam. So if you don't actually happen to have snoots, you can still control the light pretty well, just because of how narrow the flash tube is. It doesn't have one of those big round ones. So, but I think it could be a popular alternative to the mini flash, just because it's both in price point and in terms of if people like a more classically designed strobe with a big dial, it gives you that too.
Yeah. And can you do they make diffusers for it?
Yes. So right now it's just a white diffuser, but warming ones are on the way, and I think dome ones as well. But then they'll just bayonet over the top of the strobe head.
Yeah, I have to say the small light size, that does seem attractive for shooting macro. There is something, I always like any chance to have a smaller underwater camera is always attractive. So they look really nice. So it's an interesting conundrum because actually I would say that the thing that I like, one of the things I like the most about my retros is the fact that you're basically getting two strobes for the price of one, because they're small enough to be very good macro strobes, certainly in terms of length. You can slot them in next to the macro port. You can move them around. They're really not big for macro. You run them with 4 batteries. They last all day shooting macro. When you want to shoot wide angle, you put 8 batteries in. They now last all day for wide angle, but they've got tons and tons of power with it. And I really like that aspect of them. But if I'm going to Lembe and I know I'm only going to shoot macro, then there are trips where it'd be like, wow, amazing! I'm traveling with almost nothing, and that means I can put in even more lenses and other cool accessories.
Yeah. Sure.
But for me, I definitely want the diffusers because sort of on a trip like that, I'd probably do some close focus and wide angle,
Yeah.
and then you do want the ability to really soften the light off.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's not crazy harsh if you're shooting. I haven't shot any close focus with them, I don't think. But even just macro with ambient light bleeding in, it's not crazy harsh. It's not going to blow your hair away in terms of quality, but diffusers would definitely help.
Yeah, no, but I mean, if you send me the files, some of your pictures, I'll stick them in the video. When I went to Lembe last time, I took Inon's old S2000s, the very small strobes that Inon made a few years ago, and used those for a few dives. But ultimately, I just didn't like the quality of the light enough because I was comparing them against my retros.
Mm.
I just always felt that the light just wasn't quite as pleasing on the subjects, and so I ended up stopping using them. And I took them there thinking, because I used to use them all the time. I remember, back 15 years ago when they first came out, I would, go on trips with Inon Z240s, as my main strobes, and then the S2000s, like on a cold water trip or something where I didn't need the power of big strobes, and then the S2000s really as dedicated macro strobes. And I used to really like them back then. But when I came back to shooting them last time I went to Lembe, I didn't get on with them as well, and I wasn't quite. But they still worked all those years later. So Inon's products from that period were just amazing. So,
yeah, they lasted forever.
Yeah,
I still know people using the Z240s, and they have no problems with them, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, if anybody's interested, there will be a full review on DPG written out in the next couple of weeks. So make sure to check that out.
I shall certainly be reading because I have to say they do look nice, and there's a lot to be said for a small little macro strobe.
Yeah. But anyway, we know you guys like the gear ones. I'm sure we'll have more gear ones coming up here shortly. But thank you for watching. Hopefully this was useful, and we will see you next time.